Hey, what's up guys? It's Pedro here from noobcoder.com, and in this tutorial we are going to be learning about the useReducer hook. So what the useReducer hook provides us is another way for us to handle our state within a functional component. Alright, so to get started, let's go ahead and import the useReducer hook. So I'm just going to come up here and we're going to say useReducer. First thing I want to do is let's go ahead and print out what we get back when we use the useReducer hook. So when I say useReducer, and the first argument we're going to pass in is a function called a reducer. So for now, I'm just going to define it as an empty function that doesn't do anything. And the next argument we're going to pass in is the initial state. So let's go ahead and pass an empty object. So now let's go ahead and save. Take a look at the browser, go ahead and hit F12, and we get an array back. So let's take a look at what we get back. At index 0, we get back the state, so we initialized it to an empty object. And at index 1, we get back a function. Now this function is called a dispatch function. So now let's go ahead and go back to our editor. And let's go ahead and pull those two things that we got back out. So we're going to do some array destructuring. We got back the state at index 0, and we got a dispatch function at index 1. Next, we're going to define our reducer function. So we haven't set this up yet. And we're going to use an initial state. So here, I'm just going to set up a counter. And we're going to initialize that to 0. All right, so from here, let us finish that out with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and define our reducer function. So we called it reducer, and our reducer is going to have two parameters. We're going to have the state. So state is going to be the current state, and we're going to get an object of action. Now, action is basically an object that looks like this. So let me just do a comment here. So we have action, it's an object, and it has two main properties. The first property is the type. So type is just a string. So what do you want to do? And the second property, usually you'll get back a payload. So payload is basically data. So whatever data you're passing in to this reducer. Now what the reducer function must do is return a new state. So whatever you return will override the current state. So now from here, let's define two things that we want to do to this counter. So one, we're going to want to be able to increment it, and two is decrement it. So what I'm going to do is come up here and we're going to use a switch statement. Now you can use ifs and else ifs, stuff like that, but typically you'll see people use the switch statement. And the switch statement is going to take in action.type. So remember, this is just a string, and this is what you want to do. So in the case of incrementing, what I want to do is return a new state. So all reducer is looking for is a new state. So what I can do is say return counter. And since we just want to increment it by 1, we'll say state.counter plus 1. Likewise, we could do the same thing for decrement. And we'll just say decrement. And let's just go ahead and have a -1. All right, so we have our two cases that we want to handle, increment and decrement. But what happens if we get back an action type and it doesn't match either increment or decrement? So this would be equivalent to like an else statement within an if else. So we'll set a default, and since reducer is always expecting the new state back, since we don't know what action type there is, we're just going to return the current state. So now let's actually use this. So what I'm going to do is let's come down here, and instead of just saying app component, let's just print out the state. So we'll just say counter is, and we'll say state.counter, And now we need a way to use that increment and decrement that we just defined. So what we're going to do is create a button, and we'll say increment. Let's give it an onClick handler. And within this onClick handler, we're just going to be invoking the dispatch function. And this dispatch function is going to use the reducer function that we defined. So we're just going to say dispatch. And what you're going to dispatch is the action object. So for now, we don't have a payload, but we do have a type. So we'll set the type to what we want to do, which is increment. And likewise, we want to do the same for decrement. All right, so let me just move this over so you guys can see it a little bit better. So our dispatch function just takes in the action object. Since we're not passing in any data, we only have a property of type. So we're saying we want you to do the increment case. And for here, we want to do the decrement case. So if you take a look, it's going to be using this reducer function here. So what I can do is let's go ahead and save this. Take a look at the browser, and you see we get the following. So we have counter is initialized to 0. If I hit increment, it increments. If I hit decrement, it decrements. All right, so let's give more examples. So this is a bit of an overkill just to use the useReducer hook just for one thing, a counter. So typically in this situation, you would just use the useState hook. The useReducer hook is mainly used for complex objects. So what I can do is let's make this more complex. So what I'm going to do is let's add an additional property. So let's say I want to take care of user input. So we're going to initialize this to an empty string. Let us come down here. We're going to need to define a form. So let me just scroll down a little bit. And within this form, we're going to have one input. So we're going to have a value prop, and this is going to be hooked up to our state. So we'll say state.userInput. And since this is a controlled input, we're going to need an onChange handler. And within our onChange handler, we're going to call our dispatch function. So we're just going to say dispatch, and this time we actually have data to pass in. So we're just going to give it a type, and let's go ahead and call this user input. Second thing we're going to do is pass in a payload. So let's go ahead and hit payload, and the data we want to pass in is what the user is typing. So we're calling this within our dispatch function. Now we're going to have to set up a case for user input. So I'm just going to copy this, head back to our reducer, and we're going to give a new case. And within here, what I'm going to do is say return. And this time I'm going to make the classical mistake because I want you guys to see it. Is I'm just going to say user input is going to be action.payload. So what we're passing in within the payload is whatever the user is typing out. So what I'm going to do is save this. So let's go ahead and come down here. Let's output what the user input is. Let's go ahead and save. And again, we should be getting unexpected behavior. So if I hit counter, you can see that it's saying our component is changing controlled input of type text to uncontrolled. So if I hit refresh again, I should get the same thing for if I type out. So right now you saw that our counter is no longer 0. So what's happening here? Why am I getting an error every time I increment? Why is counter being erased whenever I type? So if we take a look at our reducer, the same rules affect us if we're using the useState hook. So there is no shallow merging. So when I hit increment, I'm setting up a counter property, but I'm totally ignoring the user input property. Likewise, for the user input, I'm setting up a user input, completely ignoring the counter property. So what you got to do is make sure you copy the original state. So we're going to do this for all of them. So we're going to use the spread operator to copy the state, and then we're going to change the counter. Same thing for decrement. Copy the original state, change the counter, and user input is going to be the same as well. So now if I save this, we shouldn't be getting any unexpected behaviors. Counter's at 0. I increment, it's not complaining that this is becoming an uncontrolled input. And if I type, you can see that counter is not being overridden. All right, so now let's give one more example. Can't go wrong with examples. And let's say I want to increment by a certain number, whatever the user specifies. So let's go ahead and make a copy of this button. And instead of decrement, let us go ahead and say increase by. And let's go ahead and get rid of that as well. And we'll say increase by. Same thing, every time you have a dispatch with an action object, you must make sure the reducer knows how to handle it. So let me just copy this. Go to the reducer. We're going to do a simple return. We need to copy the state, and we're going to be updating the counter. So our counter is going to be state.counter plus whatever the user typed in. So since this is a text box, we're going to expect a string, and we're going to pass in the user input. So I'll go ahead and convert that into a number. So now let us go ahead and save this. Take a look at the browser. You see that we got 3 buttons. So increment works, decrement works. If I type 10, go ahead and hit increase by. And you can see that our counter is updating by 10. So that is pretty much all I wanted to cover within this tutorial. And I'll see you guys in the next one.